This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. I'm here today with Elaine Newtson, fellow coach, and we are talking about behavioral interviewing.
One of our favorite topics, right, Gregory?
Yes. So what we want to do is provide some tips around getting more strategic about crafting your answers for behavioral interview questions.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of those things that Gregory and I have talked about a lot, but I don't know that you ever really take the time to think about and strategize your approach to behavioral interviewing. I think the assumption is very much like memorizing stories. And so hopefully we can help you come up with some creative ideas through the conversation today.
So if we're not memorizing stories, what is it exactly that we're preparing to do?
So for me, the way I think about engaging in a conversation is just that, right? I don't like labeling it just as behavioral interviewing. I think I would shift or reframe my mindset to think about who am I talking to? What do they care about? And how would I thrive at their organization? And if you think about it from those elements, you can weave some of those points into, give me an example of a time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it has to be very company specific. You have to really think about the company, what the company values, and what that person across the table from you is going to value and come away from your conversation with.
Absolutely. One of the things I love to say when I'm working with people or in coaching, specifically on interviewing, is visualize yourself already working at the company and you're talking to another colleague that works at the company. And sometimes that's a great practice to kind of shift their mindset from speaking just only about the past and to really think about, the future and the potential and connecting their behavioral stories with the things that matter at that organization.
So give me an example of how one would really go about preparing for that in the context of a behavioral interview question. Like, what does that look like? Tell me about a time when you had to influence a decision on a project.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. So if you're preparing at the highest level, I would make sure I clearly understand their culture, their leadership competencies, their core values, and frankly, what they're up against in the marketplace right now. So that's step one. Step two, to address your question, if you're specifically giving an answer to a question, I like an approach of generalizing how you address what they just asked you about. So the question you're really getting at, or maybe the competency, is my ability to influence, right? So I could just go right into a story. At this company, at this time, I did this, and the outcome was that, right? And it shows my ability to influence. But I like addressing the fact and maybe even calling out the interviewer as trying to get a sense of how you do this in general. And therefore, you can kind of generalize some approaches that make you really good at influencing others. What is it about your communication style? What is it about your work approach, right, that has helped you find success in influencing others throughout your career? And so sometimes what you can do is you can say, Gregory, as I reflect on my career, I think being able to influence others has been a really important theme. And the way that I've found to be successful in that is, and you can give some examples. Let me give you an example of a time. So you've generalized a little bit, and then you give an example. Or another approach to really connect with a company that I see some folks will use is they give the example of a time. And at the end, of course, right, their action or their impact is stated of that example and the result. And sometimes they take it a step further to say, that's how, influencing worked at X organization. As I think about, let's say, Microsoft, and influencing others in a highly matrix and collaborative environment, I think that approach would work really well. So you're still then tying it back in to your listener. So I think there's a couple different ways.
Yeah, it's like carrying it forward.
Exactly.
So it's not just this thing that happened in the past.
Exactly.
But it is, I'm showing how I will apply it at this company in this role. in the future.
And this is to my point of like, this is how I will thrive there, And I think it really resonates well with your audience.
Let's take a step back and talk about the tell me about yourself question.
Okay.
And how to approach crafting an answer that you can use and reuse and modify depending upon the company that you're interviewing for.
This is a tough one. Good question, Gregory. Let's talk this through. I think that a lot of people feel like they have to have one answer to tell me about yourself. And for our listeners, Gregory and I like to call that "tame." And their "tame" response, should be the same every time because that's their personal brand. I like to think about it a little differently. And when I am assessing someone for a position, let's say, back in my old days when I was interviewing people to work at the organization I was at, I really wanted to understand who they are. I wanted to understand why they wanted to work at my company, specifically why my company, and sometimes also why the industry. And I also wanted to know why they wanted that particular role. So if we fast forward kind of and we look at that tell me about yourself, I think you can weave in some of those elements of why the company, why the industry, why the role with where you've been. What is the thread in the tell me about yourself that brings you to the point you are sitting across from me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like the Steve Jobs quote that you can only connect the dots when looking in reverse.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And
so it's not just I had this job and then I did this and then I did this. We hope that they had a second to glance at your resume. And one thing that I like to coach people on is, don't give up all the goods in the beginning, right? Save some of those nuggets for your behavioral stories. It's that thread, it's that high level. There are some branding elements in there that bring you to this moment that you're in.
I like to say, what is the motivation that drove you into those different roles, or what is the skill that made you successful in those different roles that has pushed you to this place that you are today across the table in this interview?
Yeah. And when we're working with MBA students, one thing that's easy to forget, especially as you're practicing, and you don't want to sound rehearsed, right? We tell you to practice, but you don't want to sound rehearsed. Don't forget that logical thinking or critical thinking that got you to where you are. I love your point, Gregory, and that's what prompted this comment. I think it's the why MBA sometimes, which gets left out of the tell me about yourself. And there's such an important element of bringing that to that moment of you speaking to someone, for an MBA related opportunity. So logical thinking, critical thinking can also help play into a company's culture and their ethos, especially if it naturally aligns with yours.
I think the other opportunity that you have in that tell me about yourself is to get those key value propositions out there right at the top that you can then refer back to thread into the behavioral stories.
Yeah. I think the balance is, and when you talk about the key values, we're talking about the alignment to the company, right? Are we on the same page?
Yes, and not just like personal values, but the value proposition, the skills
Got it.
and characteristics that you bring to this company in this role that will make you successful.
And I would just add one extra layer to that. What will make you uniquely successful? Because it's hard when you have these buzzwords at cultures that are very strong, especially at the big companies, to not regurgitate those, right? And you have to think to yourself, how does my intro sound different than my competition? And so I think it is aligning your pitch, your value prop to theirs, but in a way that's unique, that really makes a difference with the listener.
I think it also gives you this opportunity to be personal and vulnerable and authentic.
Yeah. I think being authentic in the beginning is a challenge because it's such an unnatural conversation interviewing. But boy, it really kind of sets a great tone for a conversation. Even in an intense, interview, you have to try to keep it at that conversational level.
Right. One thing that I've been saying to students, which I think resonates, is that you shouldn't think about the interview as a series of essentially essay questions that are considered independently, right, and delivered orally, but that it is this conversation. It has to connect. The whole interview that you give has to point in the same direction. right? There has to be coherence.
Yeah, for sure. I think, one thing that makes me think of is trying to treat the behavioral portion of the interview as, there's this analogy, try to make it a game, not a test, right?
Yes,
and I really
yes,
love
yes.
that one because you want to have fun and you want to find it, enjoyable, hopefully, if it's a company that you really want to work at. And I think there's ways to do that. Maybe we should talk about that, Gregory. When you are getting asked a scripted behavioral interview series of questions. So let's say the interviewer clearly has 4 interview questions, and maybe they're not that experienced in interviewing. What do you think, Gregory, about some strategies to keep your interviewer engaged as you're doing these practice behavioral interview questions in a situation like that?
I think I really do think it comes down to that authenticity and staying in the moment. Even when the interview question feels scripted, when the interviewer maybe is moving from one question to another without actually being present in the moment and asking follow-up questions, it puts more of a responsibility on you, the interviewee, to really be engaged and to try and draw that interviewer out a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I think one interesting approach to that is to almost turn some of those questions back on the interviewer.
Yeah.
At the end of your answer to say, so I'd love to hear more about how this sort of thing has played out in your experience at the company.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe let's brainstorm on this engagement strategy. Maybe some other engagement strategies. For me, what I found is even something simple like what I just did with you. Does that make sense? Or how did that play out for you, like you just said? Or here's another strategy to think about. When you're doing behavioral interviews, sometimes we will recall or pick stories out of the blue, and we think to ourselves as we start talking, why did I pick that story? One thing I try to coach people about is it's never too late. So let's say you start giving a behavioral answer to a very specific question and they're going for a very specific competency and you think, I'm not sure if that was the best answer that I could have come up with. Have that conversation. You don't have to say that wasn't the best answer that I could have given you, but you can say, it's funny. It's such a visual memory for me. The reason why I selected that particular example is it was early in my career. And I really changed the way that I did things after that moment, or as a transformational moment for me. Or, I'd love to give you a more recent example if it's helpful. So you're engaging them and acknowledging where you are in the conversation. And if you're in control and doing that well, I don't think anyone can ding you for that.
No, and I often say that with the situation where you want to give an example that maybe is different, you want to give a story that is from, let's say, from the school experience, or is from really early in your career, or is from outside of your professional experience, from a volunteer experience, for example, to almost ask permission for that, right? To say, I'd like to tell you about something that happened just this last quarter, because I think it really gets at the heart of your question, which gives the interviewer the opportunity to say, well, actually, I want to hear something from your professional experience.
Well, and I think you did something really important there, Gregory. You gave me context on why you're selecting that particular story, right? It's not just, can I tell you a personal story? It's because I think this really highlights something that matters at your organization, right? That's a really good point. Context is something that I think is important, woven into the entire behavioral interviewing framework and process. Yeah.
When I was actually interviewing for this job, I think it was Jean and Colette asked me, they're two of our colleagues here at the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management. It was the last question they asked me was what are 3 things we should know about you? And without thinking about it, walking into a job interview with people who interview people all day, in career management, I didn't quite fully appreciate the level of game that I was supposed to bring. I just kind of blurted out. I only remember the first, actually, was I love food. Who doesn't love it? We love food.
Gregory loves food.
Yeah, I do love food. And while I was giving the other 2 things, as soon as it came out of my mouth, I realized that probably wasn't what they were looking for.
Right.
And as I gave the other 2 things that they should know about me, which I don't remember at all, I had time to think about how I was going to come back to that first one and why it mattered.
Right.
And the way that it matters to how I function in this job and how I function in my previous role at the Foster School is that I connect with students about food and restaurants and the cafes in their neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And it is actually, because we're both Clifton Strengths coaches, it is part of my individualization, right? That when I see someone's address on a resume, I can ask them, oh, have you been to this restaurant? Or just this morning, I was in a Pro Dev Lab session and I was talking to a bunch of students about biscuits in the area, right? And it allows me to connect on a level that is, food is deeply personal to people, right? So I had this moment of like, oh my God, what did I just do?
Right.
And then in the next 30 seconds, I figured out how I was going to bring this back to how it does make me successful. And I did, and I brought it in for that landing that really, I think, set me apart.
Right. And I think one of the things is because even though you might have been caught off guard by the level of your interviewers, I think that by preparing ahead of time and knowing that individualized connections is a really important competency for this particular team and frankly for the culture here at Foster uniquely as we think about other top MBA programs, you were able to recall on that. And so sometimes, if you're doing this portion of an interview, usually that's earlier, the behavioral portion. If it is over the phone or even in some cases over video, you can keep a couple notes on what are some really important things. I love answering this question. What are the 3 things that this company should know about me, right? That this individual should know about me? You can write them very, very small somewhere in a Post-it note, and it might keep a moment where you're caught off guard as an opportunity to be actually intentional and unique.
Right.
Thanks for sharing.
I think it also comes back to this idea of having your key message for the interview.
Right.
That you can keep on coming back to.
I totally
The thing
agree.
that you want that interviewer to remember about you at the end of the day, after the other 4 interviews they do, when they're getting together with the other 4 interviewers and they're comparing notes, what is it that you want them to remember about you?
Yeah. I think
that's going to set you apart.
Right. And if we think about what Gregory's just posed, a behavioral interview, if we're only practicing the story itself in the past tense, it's not necessarily going to accomplish that, right, in an intentional way. So bringing a mix of past tense, what's happened into the future and where we're going is a really important and sometimes forgotten element of behavioral interviewing.
Okay, so let's recap here as we bring this short episode in for a landing. What are the 3 key things that we want people to remember about behavioral interviewing from this particular conversation?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay. I think number 1, I would say balance. Balance between, answering the question, giving good examples, and also making sure you're being engaging and talking about the future, right? So that's that past, present. The other balance I'd like to bring up, so I'm going to do 3 elements of balance. Okay. The second element of balance I would think about is the balance between having a structured story, sounding kind of self-aware and self-reflective at some point in that story. And the reason why I say that is that way you won't sound rehearsed and you can be a little bit more authentic, which we talked about. Do I have another layer of balance? I do. So the last element of balance is the balance between, in that intro, right? I think it's talking about your experience and what you've done, and then that critical thinking and logical thinking, right? So I understand how you're making decisions and what you're doing and why you're in front of me. So that's kind of a push and pull with a lot of those elements. Those would be mine that come to mind.
Okay, well, the first for me is authenticity. So you already touched upon it, but I think that it's really important to think about how you bring your authentic self into that interview. Mm-hmm. And some people mistake this idea that, well, the way to be the most authentic is to just be yourself and wing it. But authenticity and intentionality around that authenticity actually takes practice and it takes that self-awareness.
Agreed.
So I think that's important, spending the time to understand how you can bring your authentic self into the interview. Mm-hmm. So that'd be my number one. My number two is threading the connections from your tell me about yourself all the way through in every answer.
Yes.
So that you're recalling back to that thing you told the interviewer at the top. Mm-hmm. Well, I really think that this is a great example of how my communication skills have helped me throughout my career, right? That kind of statement. Mm-hmm. And the third, I'd have to say the third is back to this, make it a game, not a test, right? And really go into this with a little bit of playfulness. Mm-hmm. You're there to show the interviewer what you bring to the company. You're not necessarily there at the MBA interview level, where many people are career switchers, to explain the details of the things you did in the past, right? You're there to showcase your skills, your attributes, your character traits that are going to make you successful in this new role. The stories are a way to exhibit them, right? But the stories are not the focus. It's the skills, the character traits. And I think that if you think about how am I going to showcase those, you can almost be a little bit more playful about it, because then you don't get bogged down into the nitty-gritty details of, well, I did this and then the other person did that and then we brought it to the manager who did this and so forth and so on, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're really using the story as a way to support that key message about what you bring to the company.
I think we both have we articulate a little differently, but it seems like we have agreement. Gregory, we don't always have 100% agreement, which makes us healthy colleagues.
Yes, yes.
But here we had some elements. And then the only other thing I would say in closing that I feel like I failed to mention was Gregory brought up the details. I use that analogy of balance, but strategy in what you did before, and understanding the strategy behind why you're telling a story and the strategy of where your company was versus being in the weeds, right? You got to kind of play between those two. And so I love that last point of just being careful not to get caught down in the weeds, because I think that's a really important one too.
I think this has been a great conversation on careers and professional life, and we've provided some great tips on how folks can prepare for behavioral interviewing at a more strategic level. So thanks for stepping into the studio here today.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thanks so much for having me, Gregory.
Yeah, thanks for coming in, Elaine. I hope we do it again soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate.